let's move into the start of the program. Now this is a pretty ordinary shot. This is a bunch of trees around the corner from my house, or the house that we moved into about 7 years ago. And I said to the wife, and she probably couldn't see it as well as you can't see it, it's a pretty ordinary photo, but you'll see those brown broken branches in the middle of the cypress there. I said, oh, they'll fall off in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. They won't be there long. 3 years later, another couple of branches broke. And 2 years later, they were all still hanging on the tree when the trees were cut down. So sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's not so easy to tell how quickly it is going to, something is going to fall off the tree. And to help us sort of lead the discussion through with that, I'm going to welcome Shannon to the stage. And as I said, I'm going to be speaking with Shannon on this, and we're going to be hoping to get some questions from you. And here we go.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
All right.
No.
What is an immediate risk and when does it stop being one? Okay, so today we're just going to have a little look at the planning scheme and how it relates to an immediate risk. We're not going to go too deeply into it. That's probably another 40-minute session just in that alone. We'll have a look at where there's no planning control, so we'll have a look at where immediate risk is associated with street trees, park trees, and trees in private properties, and on road reserves. And finally, obviously, when we're talking about immediate risk, we're talking about tree structure. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about tree structure, and we've got some examples of trees that could or couldn't be an immediate risk, but we'll talk through that as a group. Okay, local and state planning schemes. Where does immediate risk fit in? So in order to see where immediate risk fits in, we've got to have a look at the state planning policy framework, and we're only going to have a look at one little section of that, clause 5217, which is native vegetation, and a few examples of local planning schemes. State planning framework. So what applies to trees? So from a state perspective, it all is a state perspective, I suppose, but what's related more under state legislation is clause 5217, which is native vegetation. So that's a permit required to remove native vegetation on blocks of land greater than 0.4 of a hectare, so 4,000 square metres. Then we sort of come down a little bit and we go down to state, to the local planning scheme. So there's four overlays we'll have a look at today. So significant landscape overlay, so an SLA. So most municipalities, most councils have SLAs. The next one is a vegetation protection overlay. Which does what those? So vegetation protection overlay and heritage overlay. We'll go more into significant landscape overlay and vegetation protection overlay in a minute. But heritage overlay, it isn't always about trees, but if it is, it's usually tree specific. So it could be an old house that has a heritage overlay on it, and there might be an old oak tree and an old elm tree, for example, or a eucalypt that's on that site that has the overlay specifically relating to that. So a permit might be required to remove, destroy, or lock the tree. And an environmental significance overlay, which is basically that if someone is going to go and do a development, that development may have an impact on the immediate environment. So state planning framework, what applies to arborists, like I said, clause 5217, which is native vegetation. So for example, if a developer was going to move in and build a multi-unit development on a block greater than 4,000 square metres, they would need to apply for a permit to remove any native vegetation. Now native vegetation, and this is a bit of an argument I suppose planning departments have, according to the state scheme, the general terms, native vegetation applies to vegetation native to Victoria. So if you're going to remove vegetation, whether it's a tree, could be grass, could be shrub, you need a permit to do that. So a permit is required to remove, destroy or lock. There's not many people that apply to destroy trees, so I'm not sure why that's in there. That's more of a planning thing.
Shannon, sometimes in some planning schemes, dead trees are exempt.
That's right. So trees less than 40 centimetres in diameter for example, at 1.3 metres above ground level, they're exempt from requiring a permit.
That's in 5217 that Mr. Burke's correct. And we're going to sort of touch this in a second. There's a lot of different, well, there's a couple of different planning schemes that apply to lots of different councils, and there's slight variations in each. So this is not meant to be know everything about a planning scheme day. We'll be doing one of them soon, but make sure when you are in a certain area that you read through the planning scheme that applies to that property as much as you can.
So another exemption is to maintain a safe and efficient function of an existing road, for example, or...
Well, there's lots of different exemptions. That second one there, for those of you who are managing roads, you can do so with surety. The mining of stone, the surveying, there's lots of exemptions that are in there. As arborists, we don't probably make use of them, or we can't make use of them very often. But there's a lot of ways in which you can cut trees without doing this. If you know the exemptions.
Another exemption is emergency work. So the native vegetation presents an immediate risk. So that's where we have the immediate risk of personal injury or damage to property. However, only that part of the vegetation can be removed. So if you've got, for example, a large dead tree overhanging your house, 5217 applies. If you've got an attachment with a cavity in it, for example, the tree's died, that could perhaps be immediate risk. So you're allowed to remove only that branch, for example. If it's the whole tree, unstable at ground level, you can remove the whole tree.
Unless you've got the bushfire exemption.
Unless you've got the bushfire exemption, which is another overlay as well. Significant landscape overlays. Now these are pretty common, as well as vegetation protection overlays. So a permit's required to remove, destroy or log. This is Whitehorse specific. Okay, we couldn't, like Shane said, we couldn't go through every single planning scheme for each municipality. So this is Whitehorse specific. So permit required to remove, destroy or log, unless that vegetation presents an immediate risk of personal injury or damage to property. And like 5217, only that part of the vegetation can be removed. The other exemption here is that a tree is dead or dying to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. So what that basically means, if you've got a council arborist, an arborist working in the planning department, make a phone call from Mrs Jones, she rings up, she says, my tree is immediately hazardous, however a permit's required to remove it. He goes out or she goes out and has a look at the tree and says, yeah, I agree, it's immediately hazardous, no permit's required. They'll usually get a letter just saying, go ahead and remove the tree. Vegetation protection overlay, again, subtle differences between the exemptions in SLO and VTIO. If the tree is deemed unsafe by a suitably qualified arborist and to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. Now that's Whitehorse specific. If you've got, say, City of Maroondah, it's deemed dead, dying or dangerous by a suitably qualified person. So that means that an arborist can go and say, this tree is dead, dying or dangerous and therefore shouldn't require a permit. However, the responsible authority can still disagree with you. So we thought we'd just very quickly touch on VicSmart. Has everyone heard of VicSmart? It's a new initiative. It was introduced by the state government. I think it was around September last year.
September 19th.
September 19th. I remember hurriedly getting paperwork and everything together for it. September 19th. So what it is, it's basically a fast track process, and it was introduced by the state government. It's only for single tree removals. The planning overlays still apply. The difference with this one is a decision has to be made within 10 days, not the normal 60 days, which applies to most other applications. You can still get exemptions for the removal of those trees as well. However, if you're an arborist and you think a tree fits the criteria for an exemption, it's still good to do a little report, shoot it into the planning arborist and let them decide whether or not an exemption applies.
Shannon, what happens if the responsible authority doesn't make that decision within 10 days?
A permit's issued, I believe.
It just brings forth the statutory time frame. You can then appeal to VCAT for a notice of decision.
So it can only go to VCAT, you can't remove the tree?
No, not making a decision in 10 days doesn't give you a permit.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay.
So, how do I know? Just quickly, as I said, and we're going to get on to what we're actually talking about soon. Planning maps online, Google it, it's a state government website. Put in your property address. This is one of the best places in home, like Blackrock, if you're ever down our end of the area. This is Blackrock House. I typed in the address, 3630 Edmonton Street, and what I'll come back with is a PDF for telling me there's design and development overlays, heritage overlays, vegetation protection overlays, and it's an area of cultural and heritage sensitivity. And if I click on those hyperlinks, I then know what the planning scheme says I need to think about. Also, there's federal legislation, certificates of Title 173 agreements, property-specific plan permits and local laws to protect vegetation. And that's enough about the stuff, as we said, we're not going to talk about too much. So, trees and immediacy of risk.
Okay, so public and private trees, so obviously not all trees have, or land have overlays on it. So there's normal trees that don't have, properties that don't have overlays, so you've got road reserves, bushland reserves, and private property. So immediate risk, what does immediate mean? So we've got a couple of definitions here. Occurring or accomplished without delay, relating to the present time or moment, or having no time to intervene. So basically it means it's happening now. Risk, what does it mean? According to the Macquarie Dictionary, exposure to the chance of injury or loss. So I've got a definition out of the arboricultural glossary of arboricultural terms as well. So what that says is that risk is a likelihood or probability that something will happen, and that it's usually associated with negative circumstances. So if we put that in the context of trees, it's a likelihood that a tree or part of the tree will fall and cause injury or damage. Immediate risk exemptions under the planning scheme.
Yeah. So the word immediate is paramount in that time, in that term. If we can walk away, come back in a couple of weeks, we're removing the term immediate, so the use of the immediate exemption, immediate risk exemption, starts to become a little bit tenuous. In understanding how long we can go for without, and getting back to the immediate risk, it's about understanding when the works can stop or when the works have to stop in order to no longer be able to use the exemption. As Shannon's going to walk into soon, there's lots of defects and faults and features we're going to see in trees where we do need to undertake some management, but it's about the time frames in which those managements can be applied.
I think the last paragraph there, the last explanation there, is probably, for you guys that actually do reports, for you guys that are on the ground cutting trees, it's probably good to keep that in mind. Just because we, in the private industry, for example, think that a tree is immediately hazardous, doesn't mean that it actually is. So if you're going to make that claim, so to speak, then it's good to provide the council arborist with some evidence that supports your claim. So it might be in the form of an email, it might be with photos, it might be in the form of a small report or something like that. Something that tells the council arborist, yes, this tree is immediately hazardous and these are the reasons why. Risk versus hazard. Okay, the hazard is the part of the tree that is going to fall that day or the next and cause damage. As arborists, we may be able to determine what may fall the next day or two by identifying defects in a tree. If you are unable to identify a defect and explain why it will fail as opposed to it might, if it could, have you actually identified a hazard? So it sort of goes back a little bit to what I was just saying. If you're going to claim that a tree is a hazard, you've got to be 100% sure in your own mind that it is actually a hazard.
And for those of you who like referencing on that last slide, that's not the source of that quote, sorry. We'll fix that up.
That's my fault. So risk versus hazard continue. So a tree is considered hazardous when it's been assessed and found likely to fail and cause significant degree of injury, damage or destruction. That is, it poses an extreme risk. A hazard is a likely source of harm in relation to trees, so it could be a coat on a stem with included bark that's falling apart. And risk is the combination of the likelihood of an event and the severity of the potential consequences. So if the tree does fail, and it's going to fall on a house or across the road, what's the likely consequences? What could be deemed an immediate risk? Okay, so when we think about immediate risk, we often associate it with compromised tree structure. So compromised tree structure could be one of the following. It could be damage to roots, so it could be damage, any sort of damage, so it could be severed in a development site, could be a disease that's affected the roots, damage to lower trunk, damage to branch or trunk attachments, branches. So in this case we've just got an example of epicormic branches on a eucalyptus obliqua that was lopped for power line pruning years ago, and epicormic branches have shot up, but it could be delamination and the branches died off. It could be cavity in a branch, it could be anything that compromises the structural integrity of the wood. And a dead tree, which obviously poses a lot of different, or could potentially pose a lot of different hazards in a lot of different areas, from the base of the tree, if it's unstable at ground level, through to branch attachments and branches which are broken off. So discussion. So we had to give Terry a Guernsey. So this is a Shannon, I want to explain.
This is a 7-year-old photo. A tree that we've been watching, nice with down on Bluff Road, been watching for years and years, decided to have a bit of a rest on the house, and so we went there and had a look. See, Terry and I had quite a bit of time for a cup of coffee. It had only fallen 2.5 metres, Terry. Touched on the house, broke 1.5 tiles, but it was just sitting there for a while. And you know, we should have talked about it for a while. How immediate is this hazard? And we talked about it for hours underneath that tree and thought maybe it's not.
It's just having a rest.
So Terry made a bit of learning.
No, I didn't. It wasn't my job.
Okay, so when we're talking about immediate hazards, like I said before, we're basically talking about compromised tree structure. So this is an example of a tree leaning.
So just that last one.
Yeah.
You got a permit for it?
No, probably not. So when we see a tree leaning, we look for signs as to why it's leaning and how long we think it's been leaning for. So the sorts of things that we'll look for are fine cracks in the soil. So the cracks in the soil could be moving away from the tree. There could also be fine cracks around the base of the tree, as well between the soil profile, if you like, or the interface where the soil meets the base of the tree trunk, so fine cracks there. Ground heave, could be ground heave on the opposite side of the lean. Trunk lean. Now trunk lean, I have seen reports in the past where guys have said that the tree's leaning, but so therefore it's unstable at ground level. It's phototropism. So you've just got to make sure that if you think a tree is unstable at ground level, you've got to know the difference between phototropism and when the tree is actually moved in the ground. So the trunk might be straight and it's leaning and it remains straight. So if it's got that gentle curve in it, it's a good chance it's probably phototropism. You want to have a look at what's behind the tree. Is it shaded out for some reason? If there's another tree there, you can usually tell when the crowns are fairly close and when they've come apart. So they're the sort of little indicators you want to look for.
So just on that, Shannon, can you remind me that phototropism is growing out from under? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Moving away from, looking, well, let's just say, keep it simple and say it's looking for the light, if you like. So it's moving away from the dark and looking towards for the light.
And this is where site history really comes into play. We see a lot of trees on phototropic leans, and you've got a nice big oval and a lot of green grass around it, because we don't know that 12 years ago, 20 by 25 metre oak tree was removed there. So that tree's been growing on that lean for 30, 40, 50 years, and there's nothing wrong with it. So if we can learn a little bit about our site histories, especially when we've got leaning trees, we can get a lot more information on which we can base our decision. And
there's usually indicators in the crown. I won't go on about it too long, but If you look at the crown from a tree that is phototropic, that had another tree behind it removed, there's usually indicators. So often they'll be curving, then the canopy will get to a certain height, then the branches will grow straight up, or there might be a flatter point at the back of the crown, if you like, where it was adjacent to the previous tree or whatever was there. So there is indicators there, but obviously you're looking for more than one. Several damaged roots is another indicator. So having a look at these two slides, having a look at the angle of that tree there, and having a look at, let's say the fine cracks in the soil here, do we think that this tree is an immediate risk? So it's leaning, we know it's not phototropic, it's leaning, it hasn't got a damaged trunk, but we see fine cracks in the soil.
Can you go back to the photo?
Have a look at, remember your hazard and your risk. So what's the fault and what's the potential outcome? So it's leaning over a road.
Well, the post is going to get squashed when he goes to the little...
What's that?
The post will get squashed when he goes to the little post box there.
He will. So maybe it's a risk, maybe it's an immediate risk.
Or maybe that new building, you know, vegetation taken even before the new building was built.
Possibly. Maybe, listen, from a council, if I was still a council arborist, from my perspective, I'd probably remove it, because the way I look at it is why take the risk? We know it's moving in the ground, there's indicators in there. We don't know how long it's been like that. Possibly we do, possibly we don't, but why take the risk? So this is a tree I saw a couple of weeks ago up in Belgrave South. So it's had codominant stems with included bark down to the base. One side of the tree's already failed, so yeah. So this side is the side that's left. So there was another trunk, if you like, of equal size that fell. You can just see it there, the base of there, that fell probably about 12 months before. So what that revealed, when I inspected it, these are the things I saw. I noted a cavity in the base. So there's a really, that sort of doesn't show it justice, but I can get my whole hand right in there. Fine cracks in the soil around here. And also the soil was very soft on this side. In fact, it was soft all around the tree. Now, it's a really good idea to carry some sort of probe, or it's got a big 35, 40 centimetre screwdriver, and you program the base of the tree and you start moving your way out, and it lets you know if it's really soft and the screwdriver's going in at the base of the tree, and sometimes you'll feel that when you push it in it'll go through, and you'll feel no resistance whatsoever, then you'll feel more resistance. So you know that potentially it's moving in the ground. As you go out, you find that the soil profile is a little bit more compacted. So it's just, it doesn't tell you that it is, but it's just another indicator. So
just on your soil growth, make sure we clean it every now and again, so we're not taking phytophthora to the next side and the one after and the one after.
Yeah, so we clean it as soon as we've done it before we move on to the next room. So if we consider the three, I suppose, main indicators, or let's say four, one side of the tree's already failed. There's a cavity in the base of the tree, fine cracks in the soil, and the soil is soft around the base. Would we think that this is an immediate risk?
What's the species?
Arboriculture.
That's a good question. What species?
We're going to talk about that.
What's the target?
What's that, Des?
What's the target?
Road, power lines, and a dwelling across the road, a house across the road. The power lines are LVADC, so it's not open wire.
So knowing the target starts us bringing on to a risk assessment and talking about the level of risk the tree poses, which is a risk assessment process. But this is probably the first part we're looking at, which is the likelihood of failure, and we'll sort of stick to that and we'll leave the risk assessment for later on.
Likelihood of failure, ground level. High, yeah, I agree. I think it's high. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, codominant stems with included bark. If you see a tree like this, there's probably little doubt that it's immediately hazardous. Beg your pardon. It's a potentially an immediate risk.
Well, it's a good chance it's going to fall over. And as I said to the owner of the tree, who was sitting just on this side, a couple of metres out, on a favourite seat, and every now and again saying, "Stupid boy doesn't know what he's talking about." And after about the fourth time, I realised she was talking to her 70-year-old son. because she wanted to keep the tree. And it was a big green ash and she loved it. And I asked her to move out from underneath that stem because I was a little bit concerned. But a couple of days later, a tree company came in and bolted it, and my understanding is it's still there. So, you know, because we've got something that's going to fall apart straight away, it doesn't mean that we always have to cut it down. There are other remedial options available to us. And depending on the owner of the tree, some people are happy to go to a lot of money to keep trees for a little while, and some people aren't.
And yet most trees can, in my experience, can usually be retained. It's just a matter of how much money the owner of the tree wants to put into it. So you note on this one here that it's split all the way down into what could be the root crown and also a structural root, so it's a fairly significant failure. Okay, so this is another tree I looked at. Eucalyptus obliqua, DBH of greater than 100 centimetres, 24 metres in height approximately, overhanging road and power lines located in a declared Irish bushfire area. I first drove past this tree, then I saw one similar, probably 100 metres up the road, and I thought I'd better get out and have a look at it. And I found that the one up the road had similar issues, if you like. So, decayed lower trunk. So this whole section here is completely decayed. Co-dominant stems with included bark and pest infestation. So those co-dominant stems, they go all the way down to where you see that screwdriver. So that's that screwdriver I was telling you about that I cleaned before I inspected this tree. So I was able to get that in right straight into the base of the tree, virtually. There was probably about that much holding wood in the co-dominant stems from ground level. And I was pretty much able to get it in, almost in behind those co-dominant stems. So, immediate risk, yes or no? Immediate hazard? Pretty bad fault, pretty bad...
It's been like that for years.
Probably has, yeah. It's been like that for years. Yep. So this tree will come out, but it wasn't deemed an immediate risk. Branch attachment with included bark, it's actively failing. So it does suggest that that area of the tree is compromised. So we've got the house there, that's our tree obviously, and that's our fold. Close-up inspection shows that there's some new growth, but there's also discoloration inside the attachment in the wood itself. So you might argue that the attachment has become a little bit stronger if it's put on a little bit of wound wood or reaction wood around the base. It does indicate that it is an old wound by the discoloration in the attachment itself. So immediate risk. Yep. House under it. Yep.
Not necessarily.
No?
See that quite regularly in cycloides.
You do.
Yeah.
Species specific in some regards. Maybe not immediate risk, but you'd want to do something about it, obviously. Okay, as I mentioned previously, dead trees present a number of issues. So it could be dead or decayed roots, pest infestation, damage to a decayed trunk, damaged branch attachments, and brittle branches. So when you are looking at dead trees, you're looking at potentially a number of faults or a number of points where they could fail. Again, dead trees is probably species specific as well. If it was Eucalyptus cephalocarpa, for example, and it had been dead for a number of years, I'd probably be a little bit worried about it. But if it was, say, a red gum or something like that, I might not be as concerned. Okay, so final thoughts. We were going to do a little bit of a sort of conclusion and go back over what we're talking about. We sort of will, but one thing we did want to mention is decision making is not talked about a lot in our industry. So we go through our we go to our courses, and it's sort of taken for granted that we go out and we make decisions and trees they're removed or retained. But sometimes making decisions on big trees, where there's big targets, it can be difficult and it can be daunting, and I know that there's people out there that don't really like doing it, and I'll always err on the side of caution and say maybe, oh, the tree that shouldn't be removed, let's just monitor it, that sort of thing. So when we are looking at making a decision as to whether or not a tree should be retained, these are some of the things I do. So I look at what type of damage has occurred. So is it significant damage, is it minor damage, is it damage that could result in a failure? If it does fail, what's the risk or what's the outcome? Also look at the type of wound. So is it codominant stems with included bark like we saw earlier? Is it a cavity? Is it some sort of canker? What is the type of wound and how will that impact on the structure of the tree and how that contributes to a potential failure? Now this is very important, and this isn't talked about a lot, but Cam brought it up before. What do I know about the species? So when we're out looking at trees, and we've all seen a lot of tree failures, there's probably a tree species that sticks in everyone's mind that they see the most. So, for me, it's Cephalocarpa and it's Nicolai. So if I'm looking at a tree that has compromised tree structure and it's a Cephalocarpa and it's in Mitcham, it's probably going to have termites. If it's codominant stems, it's a high likelihood that it might fail, particularly if the DBH is greater than 100 centimetres. So, and that's just experience. There's no literature to support that, but that's just my experience. So it's really important when you're assessing a tree to have a think about the species of tree. So what do I know about this species? Have I seen this type of wound before? Have I seen this type of wound fail before? So you've got to think about all those sorts of things. Is there decay associated with the wound? So the extent of decay, is that decay spread to other parts of the tree? All that sort of thing.
Shannon, when do you become concerned about termites, considering they only eat dead tissue?
Yeah, well, you are right, and maybe it's not the termites as such that cause a failure, but I think that they certainly contribute it, because they contribute to it, I beg your pardon, because they reduce the structural integrity of the wood. Are there any other...
If you remove the tree, you're going to you give the termites an opportunity to get into your house. You just take away the habitat.
You just have to treat the house. Are there any other wounds or damage? So am I looking at one wound? Am I looking at more than one? Am I looking at a wound here and a little bit of damage there? So you've got to consider all that. Experience. So rely on your experience. What have I seen in the past, which is what I mentioned before about species. Obviously call a colleague. So there's a couple of blokes in this room I've got on speed dial. If I have any issues or I want some feedback, then I'll just give them a ring and say, this is a tree that I've got, this is the fault, this is a target, what are your thoughts? And usually, if I'm a little bit unsure, I get a little bit of feedback. The decisions I make, I'm usually pretty happy with it. If we've retained trees, I haven't seen them fail. Now this bottom one here, everyone's probably looking at that and saying, oh yeah, of course, you inspect the tree before you make a decision. And in theory you should, but one thing I do see, and in my time in planning I've probably looked at about, over the last sort of 9 years, I've probably looked at about 5,000 arborist reports. So I've been able to have a look at, I suppose, how people make their decisions, and I've been able to have a look at how council makes their decisions in relation to planning and trees that they retain. Now, this inspect before you decide, what I have noted in some cases, and I'll give you an example, is that arborists, we all love trees, but we all have a tendency to walk up to a tree and say, geez, this is a big, beautiful tree, it has to stay. And then we do our assessment based on the thought that the tree, oh, we've got to try and retain this tree, we've got to try and retain this tree. Now, I looked at 3 big sugar gums, I won't say where, that were retained as a part of a fairly large development. and I was asked to go and have a look at it by a colleague who was asked to go and prove the trees, and he got up in the trees and they were full of cavities, full of decay. There's had a significant limb failure history, including codominant stems, and one side had completely peeled out. And when I looked at the trees, I automatically thought whoever has inspected these trees has walked, and their development's only 18 months old, so they were probably only inspected, it's probably safe to say, within the last 3 years, have walked up to the trees and probably thought, I know the council that inspected the trees and probably thought, these trees are beautiful, so they've got to be retained. But you could stand at the base and you could see the faults, and now there's houses under them. So, whilst it's great to walk up and say, yeah, this tree is beautiful, we've got to retain it, you've got to try and separate yourself, your emotional attachment with the tree, step aside and do your assessment. And then, hey, if the tree's worthy of retention, bang, beautiful, it's a win-win. But if it's not, if you feel that the tree should be removed, then sometimes you've got to make the tough decisions and get those trees out. And you've got to wear the flak with that as well. So, questions? Tez?
Mr. Defect.
I've gone through the council and sort of said, look, I've been called in and the tree's got a huge lean and it's sitting in another tree.
Yep.
I think it's an immediate risk. And council's criteria, is it going to fail tonight? Well, I can't say that it's going to fail tonight, but and they know you have to go through the permit process. Can't you get someone around you? No.
Yeah.
So, is there anything that I could say to leverage council?
What was the question?
So, a tree's been inspected. So, sorry, what's your name? Greg. Has inspected a tree, it's leaning in another tree. So, it's failed at ground level? Yep, it's failed at ground level. He's rung council and he said this tree is immediately hazardous. Can I get an exemption for requiring a permit? And they've said, is it going to fail by tonight? He said, I can't answer that question. Well, no, you need to apply for a permit. So is there anything you can say to council that may sway them? I don't think there's any easy answer. Having worked for 2 councils and now as a consultant, different arborists obviously view things differently. If a council arborist was to say to me, is it going to fail tonight? And you believe it's immediately hazardous, then you might turn around and say, it could. It could fail. Short of saying, yes, it definitely will, unless the root ball is hanging out of the ground, obviously. It was. Well, maybe in that case you say, yes, I think it will.
You probably have a guess that it already has failed.
Yeah. Is it going to hit the ground? Yes. Or is it going to hit a house? Yes.
So it'd be up to council to prove that it wasn't hazardous if you take it out.
Exactly right.
You take photos. I mean, what reasonable council officer is going to take a report out of that?
Well, it just depends who I strike when I call up.
Yeah.
And some will say, yeah, take a photo and go straight ahead, but not all of them.
Yeah.
So what happened?
What happened?
They went the VicSmart option, so they got a decision within 10 days.
Yep.
It was propped up by a ficifolia in the front yard, but the neighbour had a tree fail, so it was a bifurcation.
Yep.
While at or near, sort of below ground level.
Yep.
And that had disappeared, and then this one bowed out.
Yep.
So dismantled the tree 10 days later.
Yep.
Only that it was sitting in the other tree, and I turned up and the client had his car parked under the tree.
As you do.
So I said, I'd moved that. He said, you think? Yeah, I think so.
Listen, it is very difficult. Give the council officer as much information as you can, and I'm sure that you do that, even if that means taking some photographs and flicking it through to them. They are the responsible authority, so they obviously can turn around and say, no, I recently had one where I said a tree was immediately hazardous, needed to come out. They looked at the tree, said, no, it's not. 3 days later, one of the main scaffold limbs fell across the driveway. So like Terry said, the main thing is if they're going to say no, they really need to justify that to you.
You can understand they don't want to give you, yeah, sure, cut it down over the phone if they think that it might, you know, not be a tree that needs to come out.
Yeah, exactly.
They are many different people from many different areas, and so it's always good to build good relationships with the people in the councils you work with. All councils are funded differently, resourced differently, and some, you know, the officers work at different distances from home, so their availability varies greatly. Their workloads vary greatly, so some can have more time and some can have less time.
And if you're contacting the planning department, keep in mind that generally speaking, if it's in sort of metropolitan Melbourne, outer suburbs, you can bet your bottom dollar that the council arborists are absolutely, or the planning arborists are absolutely flat out. They never stop. I worked in the planning department for about 8 years, busiest job I've ever had. One year I think I looked at 700 planning applications, and that didn't include tree removal. So they're very, very busy. So the more information that you can give them, if you can build a relationship with them, so a relationship where they know that they can trust you and trust what you're saying, then that's when you might get the green light to say, yeah, no worries, they might say this bloke's all right, we'll move the tree.
I think it's your reputation too.
Exactly right, yeah.
But constantly dealing with new staff.
So we're regional Victoria, and we're getting great year, not just planning permit people, town plans.
Yep.
So we don't get arborists,
Yep.
and we get great years to deal with our trees.
Yep. And that happens in metropolitan Melbourne, and planning enforcement officers also deal with trees as well. So it's just, there's no easy answer, it's just one of those things. The best thing to do is try and work with them and help them out, even if you meet them on site and they're not qualified, and you point out why you believe it's meeting the hazardous, which I'm sure that's what you do.
Going back to your last point about the sugar goats, you were saying sort of the emotional connection, you should detach yourself from that, but surely that's sort of the reason why most people are in this game, and maybe that should be our perspective. Like, property developers and people like that will... Sorry, so I was saying about the emotional attachment to trees. The last point you made, that you had to detach yourself from that situation when inspecting. I just find that quite hard most of the time when it's a tree of that size. Is that tree in the cloud by any chance?
No, it's not. No, and it is hard. It's really hard. But the only reason I say you've got to detach yourself emotionally from it is because if you retain a tree simply because of its beauty, for example, and it fails, and there's catastrophic outcome, then have you really done your job? Have you really done the best thing for that tree? Have you really done the best thing for the owner of the property? And we all love trees. That's why we're in the industry. That's why we go and study. But you really have to be able to, in my opinion, look at a tree, assess its health, assess its structure, assess those two things separately, obviously, and if the tree needs to come out, the tree needs to come out. You have to make that tough decision. I always say to people, and I've said to staff I've had over the years, don't worry about your losses. Concentrate on your wins. So you're not going to have wins all the time. You're going to have wins and you're going to have losses. So some trees you are going to have to remove, obviously, and I understand exactly where you're coming from because I feel exactly the same as what you do. And there's other occasions when you get to retain a tree, you get to say, yeah, health good, structure good, worthy of retention. ULE, 20 to 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, but there's those times when you're looking at trees that are in the last sort of span of their lives. They might be, 180 to 100-year-old trees that have fallen apart over the years. These particular sugar gums, there was nothing under them. It was in a vacant block, there was nothing under them for 100 years. All of a sudden they've trenched them, they've put driveways, they've put houses under them, they've put all those sorts of things under them, and they become a potential risk. So.
I don't worry about losses. What I prefer to do is make sure you get something back in the ground.
Exactly right, yep.
Let's not forget too that removal of the tree is not the only risk mitigation option. Okay, we've identified a risk because we've got a hazard in the tree, it's going to fall, it's going to cause damage. You don't need to remove it in order to reduce that. There's plenty of options, and they're going to be touched on a bit later on in the day or over the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions?
You're talking about structure of trees to include bark and co-dominant stems. I think there's very few acacias, with very few acacias.
Just trying to get them up.
But very few acacias I've seen that don't have included bark.
Yeah.
They seem to hang in there as well.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of the beast.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, that's your experience. Is there a branch bark ridge? Is there included bark? How big is the inclusion? Can I get up there and put a screwdriver down the centre? Is there decay associated with it? Is it epicormic growth? So you're looking at all those sorts of things. But absolutely right, Terry. When you do drive around and when you do look at trees, most trees have some form of coat on the stem and some form of included bark in their attachments.
Okay, questions going once, twice, 3 times? Sold. Thank you very much, Shannon Brown.